Hi everybody. So thank you so much for joining today. It's really lovely to see kind of so many people on this call. So just to kind of introduce myself, so I'm Stacey Leonard. My role is Transformation and Business Change Manager with the Adults with Disability Service at Bradford Council. So the Adults with Disability Service is a service within the Adult Social Care Department. So that's kind of where I sit within Adult Social Care. The Adults with Disability Service is led by our Assistant Director, Fazila Hafajeh, and she's kind of got a dual role. So obviously she runs the Adults with Disability Service, but she's also the Senior Responsible Officer for Neurodiversity across the Bradford Health and Social Care system. So in terms of kind of that wider work around neurodiversity that we're doing, that sits within the Healthy Minds Partnership. So the Healthy Minds Partnership is made up of 4 areas of focus. So we have mental health and mental health wellbeing, learning disabilities, neurodiversity and substance use. And then, of course, obviously, we're talking about neurodiversity today. So, sorry, I really ought to have flipped my slides over, hadn't I? So that's kind of just where it sits within kind of our partnership approach. And that's kind of where my role sits within this sphere of neurodiversity. So I have made the assumption that not everybody necessarily on this call will know what neurodiversity is. So I'm just going to play a really, really short video. It's less than 2 minutes long, that will just bring us up to speed with kind of some of the terms that I'm going to be using as we go through this presentation.
Just like our fingerprints, all our brains are unique. But for the majority of people, their brains are similar enough that there are largely no obvious differences in how they function. They have differences in things like skills, preferences, and styles. But mostly, their brains mean they perceive the world in the same way. But for others, their brains are more fundamentally different. They have differences in things like social understanding, sensory processing, communication, and information processing. These differences are a result of neurological differences, such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and more. This natural variation in our brains is called neurodiversity. Those of us with no neurological conditions are neurotypical, and those of us with neurological conditions are neurodivergent. Neurodivergent people think differently. Their unique perspectives and experiences mean they can often excel at creativity and innovation, have highly specialised skill sets, and an ability to hyperfocus. If embraced, this can be a huge advantage to organisations and society. However, the differences neurodivergent people experience can make life challenging. In order to thrive at work, they often need some simple accommodations. For example, a sensory calm environment to recharge in, or a routine with the same start and end times. Approximately 1 in 7 people are neurodivergent, so not only is embracing neurodiversity critical for a truly inclusive organisation, but it also presents organisations with a huge opportunity.
Brilliant. So I just, Shank made me aware last week that there was people outside of Bradford booked on this call. So I just wanted to kind of insert just a little tiny slide kind of to bring the context around Bradford. So we're a really passionate and proud place, is Bradford. We're the 5th largest metropolitan authority in the country. We've got a large economy. It's worth 9.5 billion. And annually, 43% of our population is made up of ethnic minority groups. We're also the youngest city in Europe, with 1/3 of our population being under 20 years old. We have around 10 million visitors a year, and we have 150 different languages spoken across the district. So in terms of that vibrancy and diversity, Bradford has it all. But we've also got some real challenges. So 34% of our district falls within the 10% most deprived neighbourhoods in the country. So that's 266,000 people that live in the poorest areas of the country. And nearly 1/3 of our children also live in poverty. So that's the kind of some really difficult statistics within Bradford. That then leads to real kind of issues around health inequalities and gaps in life expectancies, which I'll touch on in a slide later. So we've got a real big gap between the wealthiest areas of Bradford and the poorest areas of Bradford. So life expectancy is reduced by 9 years for men and 8 years for women. So just from where you live within the Bradford district. We have got significant kind of levels of poverty and inequality, and obviously that creates an unacceptable demand on our public services. So we've got a lot going on, within Bradford district. So in terms of the impact of being neurodivergent, so we have this Bradford district that's got these areas of deprivation and poverty that causes issues for people, but neurodivergency causes issues for people as well. So if you're neurodivergent, you're less likely to be in employment. So worst statistic is for autistic people. So 85% of autistic people say that they want a job, but only 22% are actually in any form of employment. Even when autistic people get jobs, they're likely to suffer burnout and stress and mental health issues and have higher levels of sickness, predominantly because they're not supported well within that employment setting because of their neurodiversity. 50% of neurodivergent people have experienced poor mental health, compared to only 20% of the general population. So we know anxiety and mental health issues is a real theme for neurodivergent people. Neurodivergent people are also overrepresented in the criminal justice system. So 50% is estimated of the prison population are neurodivergent, and a lot of those are undiagnosed. I was on a call last week with colleagues from West Yorkshire Probation Service, and she was telling me that over 70% of the people that they deal with in the probation system are either neurodivergent or have neurodivergent traits. So quite shocking statistics coming out kind of around the difficulties for neurodivergent people. And we know there are lots of barriers for neurodivergent people in terms of accessing healthcare and health services. We ran some engagement sessions around our Healthy Minds delivery plan in the autumn, and people told us that reasonable adjustments was and accessing health services one of the priorities for them, for the people who attended that session. So those barriers within the accessing health services lead to a reduction in life expectancy, but anything up to 16 years. So there's more research coming out now. So some of those figures are changing, but the figures quoted by Autistica and some of the autistic charities were that your life expectancy is going to be reduced by 16 years just because you're neurodivergent, particularly if you're autistic. So people are dying sooner because essentially their brains process information differently. It leads to sensory differences, communication differences, and differences in social understanding and interactions. So at the heart of that, and that's why I put this picture in the middle, actually what it's not about us changing our services and creating more services for people, it's about making changes in society so that neurodivergent people are more accepted, and some of the barriers to accessing all our services that neurotypical people can access are removed. So I just kind of wanted to kind of like link to the idea of one small change, that if we can make changes within society that has a big impact for people, all those changes kind of add up. So you can only do what you're in control of, essentially. So all we're asking, kind of as part of the Neurodiverse Friendly campaign, is change the things that you can change, and most of them are low cost or no cost, but have a massive impact on kind of people's ability to participate fully in society. So we want Bradford to be a place where everyone can access work, all our social experiences, the amazing cultural offerings that 2025 City of Culture will bring. And obviously, just even accessing simple things like city spaces, and the shopping centre, we want people to access those things as well. But not everybody in the district is able to do that because of poorly planned spaces, those spaces creating difficulties for sensory issues with people, our poorly thought out policies where we've not been mindful of the needs of neurodivergent people when we've created those policies, and that they create barriers that actually we now need to look at how do we change those things to break those barriers down so people can access the full range of society as everybody else can. So this is a quote kind of here from our corporate plan. So we want everyone in the district to be able to shop, eat out, socialise when they want to, access leisure, cultural opportunities that 2025 brings, set up and run their own businesses, contribute as creators, and apply their skills in rewarding jobs and careers, and be valued as employees. But we know for neurodivergent people, that aspiration that we've made in our council plan actually is more difficult to achieve. So part of what I want to talk to you about today is what changes you can make that's within your control, in your gift, in your workplaces, that actually will support your neurodivergent colleagues. So you might be thinking, okay, so why does neurodiverse friendly matter? Obviously, people who are neurodivergent really struggle with some of our policies and processes that are disadvantageous to them. Those small changes can make a big impact. So those changes that can reduce the barriers in participation, so people can participate more fully. We can promote and improve people's mental health and well-being through some of our changes. We can reduce isolation and social exclusion, because if you've got a group of people who really struggle with socialising because they don't understand those social norms and social cues, that leads to them potentially being isolated and disregarded from society. We also, by being more neurodivergent friendly, we improve access to our goods and services. And the two boxes for me are the kind of far, I don't know my left and right, really sorry, the far right-hand side of the screen. So encouraging psychological safety and increasing support. So if our colleagues at work can feel more safe disclosing that they're neurodivergent, or they're struggling with things because they've got neurodivergent traits, actually that makes the world a better place. But we need people to feel really safe, because at the moment we know that people don't disclose because they don't feel safe at work. They feel the career opportunities are going to be limited. They feel that potentially there's going to be other negative consequences, people making judgments about them, labelling them with things like you're just lazy because you can't do things. So people choose not to disclose but are really struggling in the background. So we want to enable neurodivergent people to live a really authentic life, to feel valued and included and supported. So that's the ambition. That's why we want neurodiverse friendly district and why it matters. So as I say, what I've come to ask is essentially like one small change. What can you do that's within your gift that makes Bradford a more neurodiverse friendly district? So what I was asked to talk about was actually neuro-inclusive workspaces and being more, what small changes you can make that becomes, helps your colleagues and makes a better place for neurodivergent people to live and work. So I've kind of split my slides up into kind of themed areas. Essentially, these are just kind of ideas of things you might be able to do. They're all free, essentially. None of it costs any money. They're all things that you could choose to implement if you want to when you go back to your own organisations. But they're all things that those little tiny small changes would have a big impact on a neurodivergent person. So the first thing is around like what colleagues can do for each other. So what can you do if you're working in a team with another neurodivergent person? And again, you might not necessarily know that members of your team are neurodivergent. 1 in 7 people are. So it's highly likely in a big team there'll be a number of neurodivergent people, even if they've not necessarily shared that with you. So if you can do some of these things, plus others that you'll think of that aren't on these lists, actually that makes the workplace a much more open and engaging place for neurodivergent people. So the first thing is patience and understanding. So we need to allow our neurodivergent colleagues often more time to process and respond. So some neurodivergent people have something called a processing delay, so sometimes called an auditory processing disorder. If you ask somebody with a processing issues for something verbally, there might be a bit of a delay in them being able to take that information on board, process it, come up with an answer, and then give it you back. So best practice is to allow people 10 seconds, so almost 10 seconds of silence if you ask them something, in order to process that information. It's actually really hard to do. So if you work with any autistic people who have auditory processing disorders, it's really difficult to sit on your hands. Particularly me, I'm a bit of a talker. I talk really fast. So quite often it's difficult for me to to do that thing where you just sit silently for 10 seconds. If you notice, I really struggled when Shaq asked me to do it at the beginning. I was having to count in my head, and it felt like a long time. And to be honest, I don't think I even lasted 10 seconds. But if somebody has an auditory processing disorder, if you can allow that 10 seconds for them to absorb the information, process it in the head, and then give the answer back, that's kind of good practice. This is particularly an issue around recruitment. So somebody having the time, if you're being asked a question in an interview, to process the information and not being rushed along and feeling like they're not able to get the answers out. That's something that often autistic people can struggle with. Using clear and direct communication, so avoiding sarcasms and ambiguous language. Some autistic people really struggle with understanding social interactions, so banter, jokes, those kind of things, and they might take things quite literally. So think about kind of what you're saying. Don't leave anything open to interpretation. Don't expect somebody to read between the lines, because they might not read between the lines, and then you go away thinking you've been perfectly clear, and the other person's thinking, I've got absolutely no idea what that person's just asked me to do, and then that causes anxiety and issues for them. Think about kind of sensory needs and respecting sensory needs. So strong smells, noises can be difficult for some people if they have sensory issues. So many neurodivergent people can have sensory difficulties. So quite often they can be hypersensitive to certain stimuli. So smells is a really common one. So perfumes in the office, you might think your perfume smells absolutely wonderful, but actually to a neurodivergent person, it might be really distracting to the extent that it might physically make them sick, even though to everybody else in the office it feels like a really lovely smell. So just kind of be mindful of those kind of sensory difficulties that some people might be struggling with. So food as well. Food can be another thing. If you eat at your desk, try not to have like overly smelly food. And some of this is just kind of like a normal workplace etiquette, but it impacts on neurodivergent people much more than it will be on neurotypical people. Colleagues with ADHD traits might really struggle with if the environment's too noisy, so they might struggle with focus. So if they get into a task and they're managing to focus, and then you stand at the desk having a noisy conversation nearby, all they'll do is tune into your conversation, which is then really distracting, which means they can't get much work done. So kind of just be mindful of that kind of thing for neurodivergent people, that actually what everybody else can manage to cope with in an open plan office setting, neurodivergent people might really struggle with and might not speak up and say anything. Because if your person with ADHD says, I'm really sorry, you're distracting, they might worry that actually that's really rude and the person's every right to have that conversation there. So if you can just be a little bit mindful, that'd be much appreciated. So communication preferences is a big one for neurodivergent people as well. So how we communicate might be different to neurotypical people. So one of the things that I really struggle with, if somebody comes over and like launches information at me, because I really struggle to kind of retain information that somebody gives me verbally, so I tend to write everything down. So I will ask, if somebody does this with me, can you just follow up in an email? Or I'll say, just hang on a minute, I just need to write that down or I won't remember. So I struggle with those kind of, somebody give me verbal instructions, and I prefer things in writing, so I've got something to refer to, so I can make sure that whatever it is you're asking me, I deliver on your expectations, and there's no kind of, it's not open to interpretations to what you meant, or I've missed the point, or I've not quite understood. So kind of think about that with your colleagues. That is there a way that they prefer to communicate? Some people are the opposite. Actually, they really want things given verbally and don't want loads and loads of emails. So some dyslexic people would rather not have loads and loads of reading. I'm dyslexic as well, but I would like it in writing just because it helps my executive function issues, and it helps me be able to kind of plan my day better and make sure that I deliver on what you want from me. So allowing focus, so I kind of fits with the noise bits and pieces that I mentioned earlier. So think about kind of like avoiding interruptions. So if you've got a colleague with ADHD who, as I say, is really struggling to focus, if you're constantly interrupting them, they just won't be able to focus. Also, they probably then won't get the work done. They'll end up working on evening, because the chances are actually you won't know that they're not delivering because of the environment they're in, because they'll make it up or they'll do things to kind of plug their difficulties in the background. So you'll find that your neurodivergent people probably work an awful lot harder than your neurotypical people, because they fight in some of these things where the environment's just not really fitting for our brains. So if you can kind of minimize disruptions for people, that's often really helpful, and kind of respect that focus time. So as a team, you can maybe kind of discuss how you want that. In America, they have some really cheesy things like wearing a red hat. So if you've got a red hat on at your desk, then people know not to interrupt you. I'm not entirely sure that would necessarily go down in some of our workplaces very well in England, but maybe we need something like, I don't know, can you put something on your desk so people know not to interrupt you? Or even just using things that's built in to your Microsoft products. Like, so Teams has a do not disturb function now, so it won't ping your messages. It also there's a Pomodoro timer built into it, so you can set focus time to do work, and it'll block all messages and emails and distractions to obviously to help you focus. So normalising and using tools like that, and that not having to reply to emails as soon as they come through. Kind of think about the culture you're creating. If something's really important, pick the phone up maybe and ask the person. Don't send an email, and then which then makes us neurodivergent people feel like we have to be in our emails all the time so that we don't miss something. Kind of think about kind of how your processes that you're doing personally are impacting on other people. And then another thing I've just popped in here that really helps me, that one of my colleagues does for me, is visual reminders. So if we've got a deadline, what she'll do is she'll put a meeting in my diary so I can see that something's due that particular day, and I find that like really helpful. If you can attach all the documents to that email as well, that's even more helpful for us, because some of us, as I say, struggle with kind of organisation. You might lose the document, you're struggling with reading all your emails. So if it's there in one place and somebody's kind of done that to support you as part of their work processes, honestly, it's a lifesaver. It's so helpful. So those kind of things, making it visual, having things on the wall so you can you don't do that out of sight, out of mind thing that some neurodivergent people do. So there's a real visual reminder of what's coming up and what's due. That's kind of really helpful as well. So I just want to talk a little bit about meetings. So some of the difficulty with meetings are more those impromptu meetings. So as I was saying earlier, so somebody just either tipping up and you've not necessarily got a clue what they want to talk to you about. So you're relying on all your executive functions that for some people might not be great. So your working memory might not be very good. Your short-term memory might not be great. So if somebody hasn't said what that meeting's about and given you an agenda, you haven't had time to prepare for it. And you haven't had time to kind of think over and make sure you refresh your memory. So actually sharing an agenda in advance, even for a small meeting, even if it's just like a couple of sentences in the email about what it is that you're wanting to discuss, is really helpful for neurodivergent people, because it allows us to shift our brain onto the right topic and really reduces that anxiety around maybe not performing as we should do in that meeting. If after the meeting you can also provide a written follow-up, that's really helpful. So sharing notes, key points for clarity and reference. Again, if you have that impromptu meeting, if you can do that to save the neurodivergent person having to think, I need to absorb this information, I need to write the notes, I need to remember what you're saying. And actually then what happens is they're not really concentrating on what you're saying, and what they ask of you is they're concentrating on the fact that they need to pick something up to do later on. So the brain kind of ends up getting split. So if you can at the start of the meeting say, don't worry, we'll have a chat now and I'll follow it up in an email of exactly what I want you to do, that eases anxiety. It means that the person's really clear about what the expectations of them is, and then include things like deadlines in there, so that you're supporting their executive functions. So sometimes, so I do this with my manager. I might not necessarily understand at the first pass. So one of the things that I do is I think in pictures. So if you tell me something, I need to turn it into a picture to be able to remember it. So if I can't turn it into a picture because I don't necessarily understand fully what it is you're asking of me, I might ask clarifying questions. And I might say, just a minute, I need to turn that into a picture. So like, give me a bit more detail about it. But not everybody possibly feels as confident to do that. So if you can do that for them, if you can do that clarity bit, and allow the person an opportunity to come back to you at a later stage once they've kind of thought about what the ask is, thought about what you shared in the meeting, and then they've had a chance to look through the bullet pointed notes that you've sent them of the meeting, and give them an opportunity if they need to clarify anything to come back at a later stage. That's really helpful as well. Bullet points and emails. That's another one that helps a lot. So if you're dyslexic, sometimes it's really hard to absorb big chunks of text. So if you can simplify that communication so that we absorb it quicker and more efficiently, that's incredibly helpful. So bullet pointed emails as opposed to like sending big paragraphs of text where we have to sift through the noise to work out what it is you're asking us. Or one of the things that I do for colleagues is I'll put things in bold so they can just scan it, and if they just read the bold bits, then they've got the gist of the message. People find that quite useful as well. Simplifying instructions for somebody with ADHD. So you might find that people with ADHD might struggle with executive function. So giving them a big project to do and a deadline, they might really struggle to break it down into the different tasks that needs to happen in order to make that project happen. So the kind of this one and the second one are kind of interlinked really. So if you can do some of that work to break it down to support that person, we find that really helpful. We're your best friend forever. So one of the things that people with ADHD might often do is work to the deadline. So they'll always deliver on your deadline, but they might not start it until a point where you are feeling incredibly anxious about how they're working. For them, it's their brain doesn't necessarily kick in to do that work until the deadline kicks in. So if you give somebody a deadline, they'll probably work to the deadline. If you want the thing to come drip fed before the deadline, create mini deadlines. So that does a twofold thing. One, it reduces your anxiety, and two, it really helps us because it means that we can kind of move on things and we don't leave it all to the last minute, and we don't try and bomb out 2 weeks' work in 3.5 hours on a Thursday afternoon just before the deadline on a Friday. So those kind of like smaller breakdown of steps are really helpful. And those mini deadlines. So then this one's for managers. In terms of how you support your staff, the big one really that we need to get better at is our recruitment processes. So have you reflected on whether or not your recruitment practices are neurodivergent friendly? Do you offer alternative formats for interviews, or actually are you just inviting somebody in and doing the standard interview where you ask them a series of questions, which actually is more about social interaction? And if you're autistic or struggle with social interaction, you probably don't come across the best, which is probably one of the factors of why there's such a low employment rate for autistic people. So think about kind of whether or not any of your recruitment processes are barriers to neurodivergent people. So can you offer different interview formats? Does it have to be in person? Give the questions out in advance. It's not a test. It's about getting the best out of somebody, but send it to all your people who are inviting to interview. Don't expect them to have it as a reasonable adjustment. Best practice is not to have to ask for it as a reasonable adjustment. It's just to send those questions out at the point when you invite somebody for interview. And also it does two things as well. You're not interviewing the wrong candidates, because they'll realise when they get those questions whether the job's for them or not by what questions you're asking. So also it's almost acts like a bit of a sifting out process for some people as well. But also it means that that person is fully prepared. They can bring the best version of themselves to that interview, and they're not having to the stress and anxiety about having to absorb that, like I was talking earlier, about having to be given things like that instruction verbally, the question, hold it in the head and reply back. So some of those issues we've discussed in earlier slides around that auditory processing or executive functions are really mitigated by giving the questions out in advance. So give as much as possible ahead of the interview. So do you give information out about the panel? So the person can come in knowing who it is they're going to meet. Do you tell them what the room's going to be like, what the setup's going to be? Is there going to be a quiet space where somebody can decompress before the interview, or have you just bumped them into a big holding room in a busy environment before the interview starts? Have you given them a map of how to get there? Is there a video of what the building looks like? We have a project as part of our neurodiversity health of minds delivery plan, looking at this in terms of we're looking at whether or not we can be more inclusive employers. In terms of changing our practices for neurodiversity, but also we've got a project around mapping our public buildings. So can we do videos that we put online as part of the Health and Minds website? So if you've got to go to an appointment to one of the public buildings, whether it's the council or the health service, that you can have a look at where you're going to be going and familiarising yourself with what that looks like. So for some neurodivergent people, it's going somewhere unfamiliar is incredibly stressful. So those little changes are really impactful. And then thinking about kind of when the person's in work, do you offer any support to people? Do you offer a buddy system? So one of my autistic colleagues tells a story about when she first started working in an office environment and how those unwritten rules that she just didn't know about. So things like who makes a cup of coffee? Is there an expectation that you make coffee for everybody, or do you just make coffee for yourself? Those kind of things that can be incredibly stressful if you don't understand what those social norms or unwritten rules are because of your disability. Excuse me. So offering a buddy to help somebody once they start in an organisation, just to kind of navigate and ask questions of and kind of teach those unwritten rules about things can be really helpful to neurodivergent people. Do you discuss with the person how they like to work and what information and what kind of they need as an individual to kind of bring them the best self to work? Do you think about kind of those sensory issues for a person? Do they really struggle to work in a really noisy environment? Can you offer them a quieter space? Do they really struggle with light issues? And have you popped them on a desk that's near the window? All these things really help neurodivergent people, but actually just good practice and would just help everybody. So some of the things I'm suggesting, if you did them for everybody, really help neurodivergent people, but also probably help neurotypical people as well, kind of bring their best self to work. Think about kind of that information, how you disseminate information, how people learn best, do they need extra processing time, those kind of things. What is it that the person might struggle with that you can think about how as a manager that you can support them in the best way possible. So there's a bit around that is around you as managers adapting your management style. So for me, I really hate being micromanaged. So it makes me incredibly anxious. So actually, I'm much better if I'm left to my own devices with kind of a regular check-in. But again, I will ask for help if I need it. Some people won't necessarily ask for help. So some people would like to be micromanaged. They want to be told what to do. They want that spoon feeding. That makes them feel reassured. So every neurodivergent person is different. So it's about having a conversation with each of your team members about kind of what is best supports them and how they can do the best in your organisation. So then I just wanted to touch on kind of a little bit on team meetings. So one of the things that works that neurodivergent people have asked for is that they still feel that there's not enough knowledge or awareness of neurodiversity and how it impacts people. So in your team meetings, be really good if you could host some training sessions, if you could maybe just have some kind of theme sessions where you can talk about neurodiversity, think about kind of your processes. Is there anything that you do in your team that actually is creating a barrier for neurodivergent people, whether it's your team, your wider organisation, or the services you provide, and actually start that conversation. And by having those conversations, it's also upskilling your staff and making them aware of kind of some of the difficulties for neurodivergent people. So, as I said previously, 1 in 7 people are estimated to be neurodivergent. And that awareness did come across in the consultation, the engagement sessions that we did recently. And people felt that much more knowledge and awareness was going to be needed. So one of the things that we're developing at the moment in the council is a training package for around what is neurodiversity for managers and how to support neurodivergent staff better. I'm hoping we're going to be able to put that on the Healthy Minds website, and it's open to anybody in Bradford. Well, anybody actually, won't just be anybody in Bradford. You can just go and help yourself to that training. So once that's on there, actually, sharing that amongst your team will be a really nice step for you to do. Really easy win, one small change that you could do that would make a big impact. The other thing on team meetings around encouraging open conversations. So as I was saying earlier, one of the difficulties that for neurodivergent people is they might not necessarily feel they're able to disclose or say they're neurodivergent or say they're struggling with some areas and aspects of the work. So if you can encourage those open conversations in your teams around neurodiversity, people are much more likely to come forward and much more likely to disclose the issues that they're having and the things they struggle with, which means then we can obviously put support in for people, we can change our processes, and those small changes will make a big difference. So kind of one example of that, so thinking about kind of processes and how you encourage those open conversations. If you have a booking system for the public to make an appointment in a particular service, is it a phone-based booking system and there's no other option for an individual to contact? So that will create a barrier for people who really struggle with using the phone, because you've only got one auditory input, you've not got other you've not got a visual input as well. If you meet somebody face to face, it's easier for some people than it is on the phone, because you've only got that one auditory input on the phone. So some people will avoid using the phone because it makes them incredibly stressed. So is there another alternative? Could you offer an email process, or could you offer an online booking system? Some of these things are kind of quick wins if you can identify the problems and then put a plan in place in order to remove some of those barriers. But conversely, some people might want a phone number and actually may really struggle with the fact that everything's online. So it's just kind of thinking about how some of the policy changes that you might make within your team might impact on neurodivergent people, and then making small changes that you can, where you can, in order to remove some of those barriers. Okay, so the other thing that you can do kind of within your team meetings is around sharing resources. So think about distributing guides and materials on neurodiversity and simple workplace adjustments. Another thing that's within our Healthy Minds plan is to create a best practice resource bank that will go on the Healthy Minds website. So there will be things coming out as part of the project and the programme in order to support you, that you can then share them on your teams. So the ask is, once those resources are available, share them widely. Also thinking about kind of communication preferences. Do all your team members feel okay asking for each other about how they would work best together? So that is my whistle-stop tour of things that would make kind of a difference to neurodivergent people, that are essentially free, don't really cost anything. They just require a little bit of thought and a little bit of knowledge sharing, and just kind of thinking about how you could maybe tweak things and do things a little bit differently. So we have a couple of programmes in the council supporting people into work. We have one called Into Employment that is aimed at people who are 25, and we have another one called Employment Matters that is all age. And Matt, who is one of the people who was on our Into Employment scheme a couple of years ago, has recorded a video about why he thinks doing this kind of thing is really important. So I will just play that for you.
I suffer quite a bit from what's usually known as imposter syndrome. So I felt like I don't really deserve to be here. I felt like I'm probably going to mess everything up. But being able to have a meeting with the staff and the senior learning team at Hazelbeck, we actually put a program in place for me because they understand that I am good at teaching. I am good at doing that job. I just need a little bit of support and structure around me in order to do that job to the best of my ability. And that has been put in place. I was suffering a little bit in the last couple of months thinking, I've done all this progress, I'm not going to be able to do it. But that awareness, that training put into practice, it brought me right back. And that's what everywhere needs to be doing, not just Hazelbeck, not just SORM, everywhere.
So I just kind of want to leave you with a little bit of a metaphor around change, because you might be thinking some of these things that I'm suggesting, drops in the ocean, tiny little bits. There's so much to do and so many changes in society to make it much more accepting for neurodivergent people. Actually, it's not enough. But small changes are like tiny droplets of water hitting stone. On their own, they're completely insignificant. However, over time, a small droplet of water forms rivers, carves landscape, and essentially change an environment. So small little drops, small changes can have transformative results. So thank you very much.